This was not some sci-fi fantasy or the dream of a mad emperor from antiquity. This was the British Empire, the largest political entity the world has ever known. An insane, terrifying machine that swallowed 1/4 of the planet's total landmass and held command over 1 in every 4 human beings alive.
Can you believe the sheer audacity, the geological scale arrogance required for a small, damp island nation, barely registering on a global scale in the 1500s, to pull off this colossal, civilization-shattering conquest, a catastrophe no one saw coming? Because how could you predict a storm that took 400 years to reach its peak?
We're not talking about Rome, which at least started with geographical advantages, or the Mongols, who had overwhelming cavalry. We are talking about England, a foggy, frequently defeated little kingdom clinging to the edge of Europe, desperately trying to figure out how to stop its kings from losing their heads and its church from tearing the society apart. This is the story of how that minuscule spot on the map, against all logic, against every expectation of history, became the master of the world, and how the seeds of its inevitable, violent collapse were sown in the very first desperate voyages. The year is 1558. Queen Elizabeth I ascends the throne, and the future is anything but glorious. England is poor, divided by religious turmoil, perpetually on the verge of civil war, and absolutely terrified of its neighbors. To the south, Spain, powered by the unimaginable wealth flowing from its American conquests, is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, a global superpower whose gold fleets seemed endless. To the east, the thriving Dutch Republic is mastering the delicate, profitable art of global trade routes. England? England is an afterthought, a target, a backwater, barely clinging to the periphery of European power. They desperately needed money. They desperately needed resources to fund their tiny, ineffective armies. And they were completely locked out of the lucrative land trade routes controlled by entrenched European powers. They had only one option left: the unforgiving, unpredictable, terrifying ocean, a realm they barely understood. This world-defining saga does not begin with noble intent or massive fleets of conquest. It begins with piracy, state-sanctioned theft, baptized by patriotism and necessity. Men like Sir Francis Drake, not diplomats or captains of industry, but highly skilled, ruthless sea wolves, were the first unintentional vanguards of the empire. They didn't sail seeking cultural exchange. They sailed seeking Spanish gold, exotic spices, and the utter ruin of the Spanish fleet, purely for the survival of the English crown. Elizabeth understood that if England could not defeat Spain conventionally, they would simply bleed them dry by hiring these privateers, glorified assassins of the sea, to ambush their treasure fleets, bringing the stolen riches back to London to fund the tiny nation's survival. This was the brutal, chaotic, almost accidental birth of British global power, a desperate venture launched by a queen who was perpetually broke and terrified of assassination and invasion. But theft only gets you so far. To truly compete for long-term power, England needed permanent footholds, colonies. And here is where the story gets truly dark and desperately tragic. Long before the grand successes and the triumphal marches, the early English attempts at colonization were absolute, unmitigated disasters. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese, who had perfected the art of conquest through sheer military brutality and the deliberate deployment of European disease, the English were incompetent amateurs. They landed in places like Newfoundland and Virginia. They starved within months. They alienated the local tribes through sheer arrogance and poor planning, and they died of dysentery and fever in terrifying epidemic numbers. Look at Roanoke, the legendary lost colony, a place where an entire European settlement vanished without a trace, swallowed entirely by the American wilderness in the late 1580s. This wasn't the image of inevitable conquest. This was the image of humiliating failure, driven by men who severely underestimated the sheer violence of the New World and were motivated only by the paralyzing fear of being left behind in the global race for dominance. The British only succeeded when they stopped focusing on immediate gold and started focusing instead on systemic, repeatable profit. The key wasn't the crown, it was the corporation. The formation of the Virginia Company in 1606 marks the true chilling inflection point, the moment the empire switched from royal ambition to capitalist enterprise. These were joint stock companies, the world's first multinational corporations, funded not by the king's treasury, but by thousands of small investors, all dreaming of a share in untold, bloody wealth. This radical shift from state-led conquest to investor-funded exploitation is the secret engine of the empire's meteoric rise, turning colonization into a purely cold, hard economic calculation focused solely on return on investment. And what was the ultimate horrifying engine of this corporate engine? Tobacco. The filthy, addictive brown leaf that transformed the desperate swamp known as Jamestown into a thriving, brutal laboratory of colonial capitalism. We will see how a handful of shaky wooden ships and the revolutionary invention of the joint stock company laid the groundwork for a global domain upon which the sun literally never set. Prepare yourself, because this is not the comfortable bedtime story of kings and queens you learned in school. This is the dark, visceral, almost impossible history of how one island changed the fundamental structure of the entire planet forever. The rise of the machine begins now, with blood and desperation. The year is 1580. Europe is not a chessboard, it is a slaughterhouse, and the undisputed apex predator is the Spanish Empire. Gold, ripped from the hearts of the Inca and the Aztec, flows into Madrid like a poisoned river, financing an army so vast, so brutal, that the very thought of resistance in London was deemed suicidal madness. Philip II, the most powerful man on earth, looked across the channel at Elizabeth Tudor's pathetic, fractured little island and saw only a nuisance, a Protestant rat nest that needed cleansing. England was not an empire, it existed. But forgetfulness was not in the Spanish lexicon. Survival demanded that England stop being respectable, stop trying to play by the rules of kings, and instead embrace the most profitable, yet most dishonorable path available: state-sanctioned, institutionalized global piracy. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, understood the terror. Her royal coffers were empty, her navy was a joke compared to the Spanish galleons, and the only resource she truly possessed was audacious desperation. She issued what were essentially licenses to steal, known as letters of marque, turning common criminals and ambitious merchants into privateers, the terrifying sea dogs. These were not explorers seeking knowledge. They were wolves unleashed upon the high seas, their mission simple: intercept the Spanish treasure fleets lumbering back from the New World, laden with enough silver to change the balance of power on Earth. The most famous, the most feared, was Francis Drake. He was not a naval admiral. He was a pirate who wore a gentleman's coat, a man driven by the fury of Protestant zeal and the promise of unimaginable wealth. His very existence was an affront to Spanish dominance, a living symbol of England's defiant middle finger to God's designated superpower. In 1577, Drake embarked on a clandestine voyage, not just to the Caribbean, but around the entire world, circumnavigating the globe like a phantom of the deep. This was no feat of geographical discovery. It was a 4-year global crime spree, executed with cold precision. He didn't just raid ships. He sacked entire Spanish ports on the Pacific coast, territory Spain considered absolutely impregnable, stealing tons of silver, gold, and jewels, leaving destruction in his wake. When he finally sailed back to Plymouth in 1580, his ship, the Golden Hind, was so heavy with plunder, it was practically sinking. This was the fundamental engine of the nascent British Empire, a chaotic cycle of theft, investment, and expansion, funded by the very nation they were trying to supplant. But even this monumental theft was too decentralized, too haphazard for the scale of global conquest required. Piracy provided the seed money, but the empire needed a machine, a cold, calculating, corporate leviathan that could outlive any monarch and pursue profit with ruthless efficiency. Enter the true architect of the British system, the Joint Stock Company. It was capitalism weaponized. Wealthy London merchants pooled their resources, investing in a company whose sole purpose was to seize control of global supply chains, primarily spices, tea, and textiles. For the first time, ordinary citizens could buy shares in conquest. This meant that the risks of colonization, war, and piracy were transferred from the crown, which might falter or change policy, to thousands of eager, profit-driven shareholders who demanded returns on their investment, driving expansion with pure, amoral greed.
The British Empire, therefore, was not merely a conquest of flags and soldiers. It was a conquest of quarterly reports and dividend payments. It was designed to run itself, a perpetual motion machine of financial extraction, setting it utterly apart from the centralized, state-run empires of Spain and France.
But before this corporate monster could truly be unleashed upon Asia, the fundamental issue of European security had to be settled. Spain, finally fed up with England's brazen theft and Protestant defiance, decided to end the nuisance permanently. In 1588, Philip II launched the most terrifying military venture the world had ever seen: the Spanish Armada. 130 warships, carrying 30,000 men, a floating city of death aimed directly at the heart of England. This was not a battle for territory. It was an existential struggle for the very soul and existence of the future British nation. If the Armada succeeded, England would be invaded, subjugated, reconverted to Catholicism, and stripped of its wealth, relegated to a minor, forgotten footnote in the glorious history of the Spanish Habsburgs. The future global empire would be choked in its crib. The fate of the world rested on the shoulders of men who were, just a few years prior, nothing more than glorified criminals. Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, the sea dogs were pressed into service, their piratical skills now the only defense against total annihilation. The ensuing conflict was less a glorious naval battle and more a chaotic, desperate series of skirmishes driven by English agility and Spanish mismanagement. England did not win by brute force. They won by guile, by speed, and by the sheer, unbridled fury of the elements. When the brutal storms of the Atlantic, the Protestant wind, as some called it, scattered and destroyed the crippled Armada fleets attempting to retreat around Scotland and Ireland, it was confirmation, not of divine favor, but of a chaotic, brutal luck that seemed to perpetually favor the underdog. The destruction of the Armada was not the birth of the empire, but it was the permission slip. It bought England time, breathing room, and, most crucially, the psychological leverage to finally pivot its focus from desperate self-defense to aggressive, profit-driven global expansion. The privateers had won the right for the corporations to take over, and the dark age of the East India Company was about to begin. The privateers had won the right for the corporations to take over, and the dark age of the East India Company was about to begin.
This was a corporation, armed and sanctioned by the state, given the ultimate license, the monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, essentially granting them economic sovereignty over half the known world's potential wealth. It was the birth of the ultimate multinational power fantasy, a terrifying financial hydra fueled by a few hundred greedy shareholders sipping tea in smoky London coffee houses.
They didn't just want spices and textiles anymore. They wanted the keys to the kingdom, the ultimate market control, and they were willing to wage horrific, state-level war for the quarterly dividend. They were the world's first truly militarized corporate machine, and their target was not some small Caribbean island, but the richest, most powerful continent on Earth, India. Imagine the sheer scale of the challenge they faced. The Mughal Empire in the 17th century was a powerhouse, richer and more populous than all of Western Europe combined. England was a pathetic mosquito, buzzing around the ear of a colossal giant, desperate not to be swatted. The EIC's initial strategy, therefore, was utterly humbling. They had to beg for permission, setting up tiny, fortified trading posts, known terrifyingly as factories, in places like Surat, subservient to the local Nawabs, literally paying protection money just to exist. These factories were not manufacturing plants. They were heavily armed, isolated warehouses, tiny English fortresses of desperate ambition, surrounded by millions who viewed the foreign merchants as odd, persistent, and increasingly irritating pests. They traded rough English wool, which almost nobody in the tropical climate of India wanted, for the silks, indigo, and tea that Europe desperately craved, draining Europe of silver in a relentless, unforgiving trade deficit. The company quickly realized that pure trade was too slow, too vulnerable to the whims of powerful local rulers. Diplomacy was expensive and weak. True, exponential profit, the kind that made men instant dukes and built vast country estates back in England, lay only in absolute control. By the mid-17th century, the EIC stopped acting like mere merchants and started acting like an occupying power. They began building colossal defensive fortifications, Fort St. George in Madras, Fort William in Calcutta, turning these trading posts into impenetrable military garrisons. Crucially, they started raising their own private armies, comprised mostly of highly disciplined Indian soldiers known as sepoys, trained and commanded by ruthless English officers, obsessed with tactical precision and absolute obedience. This was the terrifying pivot. The corporation was now fielding an army larger than the standing forces of the actual crown that chartered it. He was the embodiment of the EIC's chaotic corporate audacity, a man who believed the rules of engagement only applied to the weak. He saw the political fault lines cracking beneath the mighty Mughal structure, noticing the local squabbles and the increasing weakness of centralized imperial authority. Clive understood that you didn't need to defeat the whole empire. You just needed to exploit the local rot, turn neighbor against neighbor, and bribe the right general. The climax of this era, the moment the mouse swallowed the elephant, was the infamous Battle of Plassey in 1757. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, dared to challenge the EIC's burgeoning power. Clive faced an army estimated at 50,000 men, with barely 3,000 of his own, mostly sepoys. It should have been an instant, decisive massacre, the end of the English adventure, before it truly began. This wasn't a military victory. It was the world's first truly successful hostile corporate takeover, executed by pure treachery, and cold, hard cash. Plassey didn't just win a battle, it won the richest province on earth. Bengal, a territory generating more wealth than all of Britain combined, was now the property of a private company. The EIC, now the de facto ruler, immediately stopped trading and started taxing. They demanded impossible revenues, shattering the existing economic and agricultural structure overnight. They established a system of brutal extraction, known as Diwani, meaning the corporation collected the civil revenue directly through terrifyingly efficient, ruthless managers. This wasn't colonization orchestrated by a romantic king or queen. This was global governance by spreadsheet and stock ticker, a terrifying proof of concept for the destructive power of pure, unregulated, profit-driven greed. The crushing shadow of the corporate state had officially descended. The East India Company was not merely an aggressive corporation. The East India Company was not merely an aggressive corporation. It was a monstrous shadow state, a bureaucratic hydra born in the murky docks of London, yet capable of projecting power across impossible distances. This was not the polite trading of tea and spices the Queen imagined. This was the methodical, terrifying colonization of a subcontinent by spreadsheet and musket, a feat of unbelievable, terrifying audacity. The London directors, pale men sweating in their counting houses, suddenly held the destiny of hundreds of millions of people in their ledger books, a power previously reserved only for emperors and mad gods. They didn't just build warehouses in the coastal regions of India. They built citadels of pure financial dominance. Fort St. George in Madras, Fort William in Calcutta. These were colossal stone statements declaring that the rules of the local kings no longer applied. They were armed not just with cannon, but with the terrifying, ruthless efficiency of quarterly reports, turning trading posts into impregnable military bases. The company needed protection. Protection not primarily from rival European powers, but from the very people whose land and resources they were systematically and aggressively bankrupting. This required a private military machine of staggering size. Soon, this private army, primarily composed of expertly trained local soldiers, the Sepoy forces, but commanded by fiercely ambitious British officers, swelled into a colossal, disciplined machine. By the mid-18th century, the EIC commanded more trained troops than the entire standing army of the British Crown, a disturbing anomaly that should have sent chills down the spine of every politician in Westminster. The power structure was inverted. The corporation was now bankrolling and commanding a military force capable of conquering entire nations, purely to secure profit margins and crush any resistance to the flow of wealth back to London. This was corporate warfare elevated to an unprecedented scale, fueled by the relentless pressure of shareholder demand. The collision with the established, sophisticated, and mighty Mughal Empire was absolutely inevitable. When the young, powerful Nawab of Bengal, He thought he was fighting a few arrogant, overly ambitious merchants. He was grievously mistaken about the nature of his enemy. He promised land, dizzying power, and unimaginable wealth to Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own military commander-in-chief, in exchange for a staggering act of betrayal that would change the course of world history and secure Britain's impossible destiny. Jafar accepted the blood money and sealed the fate of his own people. When the fighting started, if you can call a 2-hour rout fighting, Mir Jafar pulled his 30,000 troops off the field at the critical moment, abandoning his ruler and ensuring the British victory with a stroke of corporate-backed deceit. The sheer speed of the conquest was terrifying. The consequences were immediate, devastating, and irreversible. Bengal, one of the richest, most fertile, and historically vibrant regions on Earth, suddenly fell under the complete, unchallengeable control of a trading company, whose ultimate loyalty lay only with the quarterly dividend report. The looting began the very next day. The company immediately moved from simply collecting trade tariffs to outright systematic asset stripping and tax farming. They demanded tributes and revenue at levels that were economically suicidal for the local population, funneling unimaginable fortunes back to London, transforming those pale directors into the ultimate, untouchable tycoons of the age.
Gold poured out of Calcutta. Mountains of valuable textiles, precious diamonds, and essential spices flowed west, directly fueling the explosive, engine-revving demands of the emerging British Industrial Revolution. The conquest of Bengal provided the raw capital, the necessary liquidity to fundamentally remake England itself.
But this extraction came at an unimaginable, horrific human cost. When the devastating drought hit the fertile lands of Bengal, starting in 1769, the very people who had been farming the richest soil on the planet had been systematically stripped of all reserves and resilience. They had nothing left to weather the inevitable natural disaster. They realized that this corporation was now simply too powerful, too wealthy, and too terrifyingly independent to be ignored or left unchecked. The crown had inadvertently given birth to a political and military monster, and that monster had just conquered an empire larger than the mother country itself, demonstrating the foolproof blueprint for global domination, built on pure financial terror and state-sanctioned murder. The stage was now meticulously set for the crown to step in, not to stop the relentless looting, but to officially sanction, regulate, and eventually manage the unimaginable, catastrophic wealth flowing from the conquered lands, thus formalizing the terrifying structure of the British Raj and moving the empire into its next, even deadlier phase of global expansion. The East India Company had done its job, turning a trading post into a continental vault. But when the crown finally, officially seized control, when the Raj was formalized, the flow of wealth didn't just increase, it became a tidal wave capable of moving mountains, funding the impossible. This wasn't merely capital, It was the black, shimmering oil lubricating the greatest engine of expansion the world had ever known, powering the very industrial revolution that would make Britain utterly unbeatable. While the factories of Manchester roared, consuming the cheap cotton torn from the fields of India and the Caribbean, the real, terrifying transformation was happening on the waves, in the clangorous, smoke-filled dockyards of the island. The Royal Navy, already a global force of terrifying reputation, morphed into something mythological, the undisputed, iron-willed master of every single ocean on Earth, enforced by fleets of dreadnoughts and armored cruisers. They didn't just patrol the seas, they owned them, enforcing a brutal, self-proclaimed law known ironically as the Pax Britannica, the British peace. This peace was merely the absence of any power strong enough to challenge London's terrifying monopoly on violence. A shield forged from steel and the forced labor of millions, protecting the vital lanes that delivered the lifeblood of the empire straight to the heart of the mother island. No commodity was safe, no port was untouchable, provided it could feed the insatiable machine. And what happens when a small, cold island nation suddenly realizes it has unlimited funds, an invincible navy, and a desperate internal need for more raw material than its current territories could possibly provide?
They look, inevitably, to the last great prize, the untouched, terrifying continent, Africa. The latter half of the 19th century saw a manic, chaotic explosion of greed known chillingly as the Scramble for Africa, a high-stakes, ruthless poker game played between the major European powers, with the lives and futures of entire civilizations as the disposable chips.
Britain entered this unprecedented game with the swagger and confidence of a predator that already knew it had won before the first cannon fired. Men like Cecil Rhodes, a figure whose very name should send shivers down the spine of history, and whose ambitions dwarfed those of mere kings, didn't see land or people. They saw an economic map, dreaming not of scattered colonies, but of drawing a literal red line, a continuous, seamless railway from Cape to Cairo. This was not noble exploration. It was a hostile, brutal corporate takeover on a continental scale, justified by the poisonous, self-serving doctrine of the civilizing mission, a belief that they were somehow doing the conquered people a colossal favor by stealing their resources, violently reorganizing their societies, and rewriting their entire existence under the iron heel of London. They carved up maps in drawing rooms thousands of miles away, dividing ancient kingdoms, ignoring tribal boundaries, and creating future disasters, just so the red on the global map could expand infinitesimally further. But if you want a true, horrifying measure of the empire's terrifying indifference to human cost, look not to the vast arid deserts of Sudan, but to the shimmering ancient ports of China. The British Empire had a massive problem. They loved Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, consuming vast quantities of these luxuries. But the Chinese didn't need anything Britain produced in return.
leading to a massive, destabilizing outflow of silver from London's coffers. Their monstrous, unimaginable solution: to deliberately, methodically, and criminally addict an entire ancient nation to drugs. When the noble Qing dynasty, horrified by the destruction of its society, tried desperately to stop this literal state-sponsored drug trafficking, Britain didn't negotiate. It didn't compromise. It immediately launched the First Opium War with cold, mechanical precision. They used the unstoppable might of their terrifying iron-hulled steamers and heavy cannon to force the Chinese to accept the poisons, demanding open ports, seizing territory like Hong Kong, and imposing humiliating treaties that crippled Chinese sovereignty for a century. The sheer geographical improbability of running an empire where the sun literally never set required more than just ships and soldiers. It required instant, lightning-fast communication across impossible distances. The advent of the submarine telegraph cable was perhaps the most silent yet revolutionary weapon in the empire's arsenal, instantly connecting Calcutta, Cape Town, Sydney, and London across thousands of miles of ocean floor. Suddenly, a viceroy on the far side of the world could receive complex orders, clarify delicate policy, and report massive uprisings in hours, not months, centralizing decision-making power in the icy hands of the colonial office. This intricate underwater network of copper and gutta percha solidified centralized control, turning the chaotic red map into a single, terrifyingly efficient administrative machine, run by an endless stream of paperwork and colonial administrators. The bureaucracy expanded exponentially, an endless torrent of documents detailing tax collection, land seizure, judicial review, and the complex classifications of newly discovered and categorized peoples, each piece of paper meticulously reinforcing the rigid, racist hierarchy necessary to maintain iron-fisted control over subject populations vastly larger than the ruling class itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at its grotesque, glittering zenith. It claimed dominion over nearly a quarter of the world's land area and a quarter of its population. The red lines on the map had reached their maximum saturation, defining a geopolitical reality that seemed utterly unshakable, a permanent, terrifying feature of the world landscape, taught in every schoolroom. Yet, beneath the veneer of elaborate parades, technological superiority, and the endless, relentless flow of colonial resources, the seams were beginning to fray. The very brutality and scale required to maintain this impossible structure had irrevocably sown the bitter seeds of its own destruction, forging hardened resentment and organized resistance movements from the streets of Dublin to the hidden corners of Delhi. The empire was an edifice of terror, built on centuries of calculated aggression, and now, finally, the architects were looking up at their creation and realizing it was too tall. They stood at the absolute zenith of human power, controlling a quarter of the Earth's land and a fifth of its population. Yet the fear gripping London was more acute than it had been when the Spanish Armada sailed.
Because now, the enemy wasn't a single naval power crossing the channel. The enemy was time, the unstoppable grinding force of history, and the terrifying realization that every single nation they had humiliated or exploited was now watching, calculating their moment of weakness. The air itself crackled with anticipation, a global silent countdown to oblivion, and the men in Whitehall could feel the pressure mounting, a geological shift beneath their very foundations. The greatest threat, the true existential terror, did not come from the ancient, crumbling empires of the East, but from two utterly ferocious, industrialized newcomers, the monolithic brute across the Atlantic, the United States, and the hyper-aggressive, iron-willed upstart tearing through Europe, Imperial Germany. The American Colossus was already an economic titan, effortlessly surpassing British industry in steel production, coal output, and sheer, raw capitalist vitality. London knew it could manage America. They shared blood, language, and crucially, a mutual commercial interest. But Berlin? Berlin was a declaration of war etched in Krupp steel. The very idea that any nation could challenge the Royal Navy was once a joke, a treasonous whisper echoing only in the deepest taverns of Europe. The fleet ruled the waves, a silent, ubiquitous shield that made the entire imperial structure possible. But the Germans understood the math. Control of the sea meant control of the world. And they began building their battle fleet with a horrifying, manic efficiency that shocked the Admiralty into stunned silence. This wasn't just a shipbuilding race. It was a desperate, financially ruinous game of poker played with the entire world's treasury, a competition to see who could bankrupt themselves faster in the pursuit of ultimate violence. Britain had a sacred, non-negotiable rule, the two-power standard. The Royal Navy must be stronger than the next two largest navies combined, a commitment that demanded almost half of the national budget. Germany's challenge shattered this fragile balance, demanding an unprecedented, desperate escalation that mortgaged Britain's future and siphoned capital away from every other conceivable project, foreign or domestic. Then came the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a technological scream that changed everything, a single moment that accelerated the world toward war. This revolutionary battleship, faster, stronger, and armed only with massive, unified big guns, instantly rendered every other warship in the world obsolete, including Britain's own vast historic fleet. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a floating fortress of incomparable power, but it was also a catastrophic equalizer. Suddenly, the centuries of accumulated naval dominance, the vast catalog of older, smaller ships, were wiped clean. Every nation, including Germany, could start the race from zero, and the sheer speed and quality of German industrial production meant they could keep pace with, or even surpass, the old master. The German yards were churning out these oceanic behemoths with the speed of a dark, mechanical miracle, threatening to make the English Channel a contested waterway for the first time in generations. The response from the Admiralty was frantic, bordering on hysterical. They demanded more ships immediately. The cry echoed through the streets of the island nation, a collective gasp of fear and desperation. "We want 8, and we won't wait." It was the sound of a panic attack on a national scale, realizing that the very foundation of their existence, naval supremacy, was disintegrating before their eyes, brick by technological brick. The cost was staggering, utterly incomprehensible to the average taxpayer. Every pound spent on a battleship was a pound not spent on social reform, on addressing the desperate poverty gnawing at the industrial cities, or on maintaining the increasingly restless and expensive corners of the empire. The financial pressure was a slow-motion catastrophe, an internal hemorrhaging of capital, but it was deemed necessary, for without the navy, the empire was merely a collection of distant, undefended possessions, waiting to be plundered by any ambitious predator. The focus shifted abruptly from expansion to rigid, terrifying defense, consolidating the wealth and resources they already possessed, desperately shoring up the diplomatic walls around the continental powder keg. Britain, the master of global chaos, the great offshore manipulator, now found itself dragged inexorably into the claustrophobic, paranoid alliances of European terrestrial warfare, something its leaders had always tried to avoid at all costs. They found themselves tied to the volatile, unstable continental powers. France, forever seeking revenge against Germany for past humiliations, and Russia, a slow-moving, massive bear whose future intentions were impossible to predict, and whose internal stability was perpetually questionable. The Triple Entente was not an alliance of affection. It was a marriage of convenience, necessity, and sheer cold terror, aimed squarely at containing the monstrous, burgeoning ambition of Berlin before it could consume the European continent entirely. As the decade marched toward 1914, the decisions being made in London were no longer about expanding their territory into some obscure corner of Africa. They were about sheer, bloody survival in the face of mechanized doom. Every diplomatic decision was a tightrope walk over a financial abyss, knowing that any mistake, any miscalculation could ignite the entire world in a blaze that would consume them all. The vast machine of the empire, designed to project power outward and extract wealth, was now being forced to look inward, straining under the weight of its own success and the accelerating pace of global technological warfare. The very wealth extracted from India and Africa was now being poured into the gaping, bottomless maw of naval competition, creating a terrifying feedback loop of industrial paranoia and inevitable collision. The stage was set. The alliances were hardened, the armies mobilized in secret, and the navies loaded with shells. The world, already carved up into spheres of influence, was now sitting on a single, shared fuse, waiting for the match. Britain, the nation that had perfected the art of proxy war and financial manipulation, was about to be dragged into the most catastrophic, industrialized slaughter ever conceived by man. A war that would finally prove whether the impossible structure of the empire could withstand the true,
sustained force of global violence.
The era of easy conquest was over. The era of existential reckoning was about to begin, and it would start not with a whisper of trade winds, but with the deafening, earth-shattering roar of the Great War, the true beginning of the end for the Empire's terrifying, improbable global reign. It was the moment the sleepless historian realized that even the mightiest empires eventually run out of time, and the clock was ticking down to zero. They called it the Pax Britannica, the Great British Peace, but let no historian ever be fooled by such a soothing lie. This was not peace. This was suffocating control, a golden age of terror where the globe held its breath, awaiting the next crushing decree from a damp, distant island thousands of miles away. The sun never set, a glorious, undeniable fact, but the sleepless historian knew this was no blessing. It was a constant, blinding spotlight revealing every single weak point, every stretch mark on the strained body of the empire. The system was held together not by diplomacy, but by sheer, relentless steel and the invisible, crushing weight of expectation that prevented any colonial upstart from daring to look toward independence. The scale of this operation defied logic. Managing 400 million subjects, governing territories that spanned jungles, deserts, mountains, and ice caps, required an administration that was simultaneously omnipresent and profoundly invisible. London was running the greatest logistical enterprise in human history, moving soldiers, governors, raw materials, and mountains of paperwork across latitudes and longitudes, conquering the tyranny of distance through sheer will and terrifying infrastructure. To manage this monstrous sprawl, Britain had to shrink the world, to compress time and space until the distance between London and Calcutta felt like a mere carriage ride. The engine of this compression was technology, weaponized industrial might turned into infrastructure designed purely for extraction. The Royal Navy, now powered by coal and steam, became an inescapable iron fist, capable of delivering instant, localized violence anywhere on the map, faster than any power had ever conceived. These iron behemoths didn't rely on the vagaries of wind. They delivered the will of Whitehall with uncompromising, mechanical reliability. But the true nerve center, the whispering, insidious brain of the empire, was the undersea telegraph cable. Running across ocean floors, laid down by specialized ships like the Great Eastern, these cables transmitted orders, market prices, and ultimatums at the speed of light, bypassing the months-long delays of sailing ships. This instantaneous communication meant that rebellion could be crushed before it even fully ignited, and market manipulations could be executed with ruthless precision across continents simultaneously. It was the first true global nervous system, and Britain was the only hand on the switch, monitoring every pulse. Then came the Suez Canal, a surgical incision through the world's geography, dramatically slashing the travel time to India, transforming the strategic calculus of the entire Middle East overnight. It wasn't built for local trade. It was a military and economic highway, securing the jewel in the crown, India, with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The empire had essentially weaponized geography, reshaping the planet's transit lanes to serve its singular, greedy purpose. The acquisition of the canal shares became one of the most defining acts of 19th century realpolitik, sealing the fate of Egypt and ensuring British dominance over the trade lanes to the east. But the cost of maintaining this divine absurdity was astronomical, measured not just in endless pounds sterling, but in the moral corrosion necessary to justify its existence. Consider the sheer, unadulterated cynicism of the Opium Wars, a narrative so dark it stains the very soul of the Victorian age. A nation built on trade found itself with a massive trade imbalance with China, which only wanted silver for its tea and silks. Britain's solution was simple, sickening, and utterly effective. Flood China with highly addictive opium grown in India, creating a nation of addicts dependent on British trade. When the Qing government desperately tried to stop this state-sanctioned drug trafficking, Britain launched wars, not for territory, but for the fundamental right to poison an entire population for profit. The resulting treaties were brutal, humiliating, and carved out Hong Kong as a permanent staging ground for global dominance, a testament to pure economic brutality.
Meanwhile, India, the very heart that pumped the empire's lifeblood, was systematically drained. Its own industries were crippled to serve Manchester's textile mills, and its vast wealth was transferred to the treasury in London, financing everything from railway expansion in Canada to wars in Africa.
The Great Game, that terrifying, silent struggle against the expanding Russian bear in Central Asia, consumed untold resources and generations of spies, officers, and diplomats. It was a paranoid, frozen conflict, stretching across mountains and deserts, driven by the existential fear that Russia might somehow destabilize the route to India, which was the key to everything. The empire was fighting ghosts in the sands of Afghanistan and simultaneously managing vast, complex populations in Canada, Australia, and South Africa. This was not strength. It was overextension wrapped in the banner of destiny, the relentless spinning of plates that could never stop. The sleepless historian saw the cracks forming, thin as hairline fractures in a monumental statue. The world was changing, and Britain's industrial advantage, the secret weapon that fueled its rise, was being rapidly eroded by new competitors who had learned the hard lessons of global power. Germany, unified and fiercely militaristic, was building a high seas fleet designed explicitly to challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy, a direct threat to the very foundation of the empire's existence.
The Kaiser was not playing games. He was building a weapon aimed squarely at the heart of London.
Across the Atlantic, the United States, once a rebellious colony, was transforming into an industrial titan, a behemoth whose sheer economic scale would soon dwarf the entirety of the British Isles. The student was about to surpass the master, not through conquest, but through the overwhelming power of sheer production capacity. The first catastrophic warning sign flashed bright red in South Africa during the Boer War. Fighting against two small, determined republics of Dutch settlers, the British Army, the supposed pinnacle of global military might, struggled bitterly, requiring massive deployments and 3 years of grueling, dirty warfare. The war exposed crippling logistical failures, deep ethical crises, the invention of concentration camps, and the terrifying cost of colonial ambition. It was a victory, yes, but it tasted like ashes and revealed a fundamental, structural weakness in the imperial model. The world watched, astonished, as the behemoth stumbled, revealing that perhaps, just perhaps, the iron grip was starting to tremble. The sheer weight of holding up 25% of the world was becoming too much for one small island to bear, and the rivals were now circling, hungry for the coming feast. The historian closed the book on the 19th century, feeling the chilling certainty. The clock had not stopped. It had merely sped up. The age of unchallenged supremacy was over. The 20th century would be the great reckoning, the final terrifying collapse of the improbable dream. The dream was beautiful, yes, but it was built on sand and gunpowder. And by the year 1900, London, the smug, undisputed master of the universe, finally registered the terrifying tremor running beneath the golden foundations. For a century, the Pax Britannica had been a comfortable, self-satisfied blanket woven from global trade and naval supremacy. But now, a new, younger, infinitely more aggressive power was rattling the chains, staring directly across the North Sea with ill intent. The terrifying realization dawned in Whitehall like a cold dawn. The empire was not merely aging, it was being actively stalked. That stalker wore the crisp, terrifying uniform of the German Empire, led by a volatile, insecure emperor named Wilhelm II, who decided the only way to be taken seriously was to build a battle fleet so massive, so technologically advanced, that it could look the mighty Royal Navy directly in the eye and spit. This wasn't just shipbuilding. This was an act of global existential provocation. The Kaiser understood instinctively that Britain's power was literally afloat, sustained by the endless blue horizon, and if you threatened the water, you threatened the very air the English breathed. The resulting arms race, the desperate, furious scramble to launch bigger, faster, and more heavily armored dreadnoughts, consumed the national budget like a starving predator, forcing Britain to finally bleed out the gold reserves it had accumulated over 3 centuries of ruthless global exploitation. Every new German keel laid down was a direct, lethal threat to Sydney, to Calcutta, to Vancouver. The sheer logistical nightmare of maintaining the sacred two-power standard the doctrine demanding the Royal Navy be stronger than the next two largest navies combined, became fiscally impossible, a joke written in red ink. The government was suddenly, brutally forced to choose between providing basic social reform for its starving population at home or maintaining the impossibly large, costly empire abroad. They tried to do both, which meant they failed at everything, stretching their resources until the fabric of society was thin and ragged. And then, the unspeakable happened. A single Bosnian terrorist lit a match in Sarajevo, and the intricate, delicate clockwork of European alliances exploded into the most horrific, self-inflicted wound humanity had ever known. Britain, bound by a web of treaties and paralyzed by fear of German continental dominance, threw the full, terrifying weight of its global machine into a muddy, 4-year abattoir in Belgium and France. This was the precise moment the empire truly began its long, painful process of eating itself alive. Think of the sheer, staggering brutality of it. Millions of young men dragged from the sun-baked plains of India, the desolate deserts of Egypt, the remote, peaceful farms of Australia and New Zealand, and plunged headlong into the cold, industrial horror of the Western Front. They fought a war of purely European dynastic squabbles and imperial jealousy, yet they died in unimaginable numbers to preserve an empire that still treated them as expendable, second-class subjects. The war did not just cost lives, it cost the financial bedrock of the entire imperial structure. Britain entered the conflict in 1914 as the world's greatest creditor, the unparalleled financial heart of the globe, the keeper of the gold standard. It emerged 4 years later, a crushing, exhausted debtor, owing staggering sums, especially to the rapidly ascendant, ruthlessly profitable United States of America. The gold standard, the proud, immutable symbol of British financial supremacy, was shattered, never truly to be restored. They had liquidated global assets, sold off precious foreign investments, and essentially mortgaged the entire future of the empire just to buy the shells needed to survive the trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele. But perhaps the deepest, most corrosive wound was psychological and moral. How do you maintain an ideology of racial and cultural superiority when millions of colonial troops, Indian sepoys, African askaris, Canadian woodsmen, white European nations, tearing each other apart with suicidal technological efficiency? The spell was irrevocably broken. The myth of white infallible governance, the core psychological weapon of the empire used to pacify billions, was irreparably damaged in the mud of Flanders. And the moment the dust settled, the instant the guns fell silent in 1918, the demands for self-determination that had been mere whispers in the colonies for decades suddenly became a thunderous, unstoppable roar. London, reeling, confused, and utterly exhausted, tried desperately to glue the pieces back together, pretending that nothing fundamental had changed. They even added new territories, stretching their control over parts of the Middle East, carving up the defeated Ottoman Empire in a desperate, last-gasp land grab that completely disregarded existing borders and local populations, sowing the seeds of perpetual future conflict. This was the high water mark, the moment of greatest geographical extent. But it was a phantom empire, a vast hollow shell. They had more territory than ever before, but less power, less money, and infinitely less moral authority to hold it. Ireland, closer than any colony, had already slipped the leash, establishing the Irish Free State, a terrible, successful precedent, setting a revolutionary fire that would inevitably spread across the global dominions. The next 2 decades were defined by economic collapse, the Great Depression hitting the global trading system like a world-ending sledgehammer, and the terrifying, violent rise of truly modern, non-European rivals like Imperial Japan. The illusion of complete maritime security vanished forever. The Royal Navy, though still vast, was fundamentally incapable of defending the entire global trading network from simultaneous threats in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the burgeoning Pacific theater. The British Lion was tired, starved, and still roaring defiantly. But the roar now sounded dangerously like a desperate wheezing cough. They were clinging to India, the jewel in the crown, with increasing violence and paranoia, recognizing with cold certainty that if India fell, the entire edifice would follow within a single, terrifying generation. The stage was set, the debts were astronomical, and the forces of modernity were gathering. The Second World War was coming, and this time, for the empire, there would be no recovery, only oblivion.